Welcome to the Inner Work Community Podcast, which aims to provide you with language, tools, and guidance in your journey towards personal and relational wholeness. We'll discuss topics ranging from psychology, spirituality, tantra, leadership, sexuality, polyamory, and more. My name is Michael, and I'll be your host for insightful interviews with thought leaders, practitioners, and experts who have a thing or two to share about living an integrated and meaning-making life. Whether you're looking to deepen your connection with your interior world, overcome challenges in your relationships, or expand your psychosomatic horizons with fresh perspectives and paradigms, the Inner Work Community Podcast offers a safe yet challenging space for dialogue and introspection. This is all a gift, so let's go enjoy it together. In this first episode of the Inner Work Community Podcast, I sit down with renowned Jungian analyst Dr. Murray Stein to explore his groundbreaking book, Jung's Map of the Soul. Dr. Stein shares insights into Jung's core concepts such as persona, shadow, anima, and animus. All of these offer a map that guides us on our journey towards wholeness. Whether you're new to Jungian psychology or simply looking to dive deeper into your inner world, this conversation provides valuable wisdom, reassurance, and an invitation to experience life. I want to start us off with kind of a 30,000 foot view question. So your book, Jung's Map of the Soul, lays out the structure of Jung's ideas in a very accessible way. I think accessible and challenging, right? It's like, okay, we've got to really stretch here. We've got to focus in. Can you tell us, why is Jung's map and theory so useful for growth towards wholeness, particularly for those of us who are coming out of kind of the Christian mythos, if that makes sense?
Well, there's a simple answer and a very complex answer to that, a very long-winded one. But the simple answer is it helps you to understand your experience, particularly your numinous experiences and your religious experience. Depth psychology is founded on experience. It doesn't start with theory, it starts with experience. And the theory is a way of looking at the experience and placing it in certain categories, naming features of experience, understanding the experience from a particular perspective. And another thing to be very clear about that, the map is not the trip or the journey. The map can guide you on the journey, but you have to take the journey, okay? Or most of you are on a journey, well launched in your journeys. You're not teenagers anymore looking at what's ahead. You can very well now reflect on what you've lived. And in that reflection on what you've lived and looking back, you can identify certain key events, certain key moments in your experience, decisions you made, important dreams you've had, maybe even mystical experiences that you've had or tried to have, and synchronicities, chance events that changed your life. That was my experience. That's how I discovered Jung. Somebody mentioned Jung's name at a party, and I went out and bought his book, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, his memoir written with Anila Yaffe. And I couldn't put it down. It's the first time I really encountered Jung's thinking. And he starts off by saying, I'm going to tell you my story. This is my myth. This is my experience. And then he goes on to relate how the self incarnated itself in his life experience. That's the basic idea of the self. It's there at the beginning and it unfolds. And if you don't block it with defenses or complexes or resistances, it will unfold itself in your life, and looking back, you will see the pattern that your life has followed and has made to that point. So the map of the soul is a way of naming certain experiences. Where does it come from? It comes from Jung's experience. Um, if you want to read the raw material of his experience before he formulated it and put it all into a nice framework of psychological theory, you now can read the Red Book, which is his something he created for himself. It isn't really a personal diary exactly, but it's an edited, elaborated account of experiences that he had at his midlife period. And if you want to read even more raw material, read the Black Books. Those are his journals. Those have now been published in the last couple of years, the Black Books. And it's out of this experience and also with his patients. He was a psychiatrist at midlife, already famous with his research in psychiatry and psychoanalysis with Freud. But he recreated himself at midlife, and he founded a new theory called analytical psychology, based on his experience as an analyst with patients and his own personal experience in working with his dreams and what he calls active imagination. Those were the two doorways into the unconscious for him. There are other ways to get into the unconscious. Nowadays, people take psychedelics. Jung never did that, but that is a doorway for some people. I haven't tried it myself, but I've worked with people who have, and it can be quite useful in opening up to some of the deeper levels of the unconscious. So Jung names and categorizes what he experienced. So he talks about the persona. That's the part of ourselves that we offer to the people around us, to the public. It's how we interface with the world around us. It's our official reputation and character and how we want to be perceived, how we dress, how we present ourselves. And it's very important to have a well-developed one if you want to be successful in the world around you and have friends. And, you have to develop certain qualities that other people share and accept. That's persona. Then he named another part of the experience, shadow. That's the opposite of persona. It's what you want to hide. It's what you're ashamed of. It's what you don't want to talk about with other people. It's what you don't want to acknowledge yourself. You repress it. That's what Freud discovered, he said. Freud discovered the shadow of the Viennese hypocrites. Viennese were famous for their hypocrisy. They would say one thing in public and do something very different in private. So Freud exposed all that, and he said, we all have an id. It isn't just bad people who have an id. We all have an id. And Jung went with that, and he called it the shadow. And there's the anima. He says it's man's age-old experience of woman. And woman has an animus. It's woman's age-old experience with a man. And that's how he categorized these areas of experience. And he then theorized about them and had a lot more to say in his theory. And then he talks about the self. That's an overarching concept that embraces everything in the psyche. It's the psyche's totality. It includes the ego, your conscious sense of self, the I, and it includes everything else that you don't know about or that you're not aware of. And as you, quotes, individuate or become more conscious, you see more and more of the self, and you help the self to become part of your life. In other words, we call it integration of what's unconscious. So you develop in the course of your life experience through using this map, you develop self-knowledge, self-understanding, self-acceptance, and a kind of complexity that you wouldn't be aware of if you hadn't taken the journey or looked carefully at experience. People have experiences and they don't know what to do with them. They have big experiences, they have traumatic experiences, they don't know where to put them. And if you don't know where to put them, they tend to fade away or they get repressed, forgotten, pushed in the cupboards, and they don't serve much of a purpose. So if you know or have an inkling of where that comes from and what it might mean for you, you can do something with it. Jung once said that he was astonished at how little attention most people paid to their numinous experiences. Everybody has them time to time, one time or another. A numinous experience is an experience of an archetype. The archetype shows its face and you experience it in a projection or a moment of enlightenment or vision. You experience an archetypal image. Well, what do you do with it? A lot of people don't understand what that is, don't want to talk about it because they think people will think they're crazy. They won't be understood. Jung himself had that feeling. And that's why he didn't, in his lifetime, publish his Red Book. He thought people would think he was crazy because he had these weird experiences in the night. He worked during the day as a normal physician, psychiatrist, analyst, and a family man. I once talked to his son, Franz Jung, this was many years ago, and asked him, what was your father like when he was going through this terrible crisis in his midlife period? You know, he calls it confrontation with the unconscious and memories, dreams, reflections. It sounds like he almost went mad. And his son said, oh, we didn't notice anything. We went on camping trips. We went sailing together. The family had good times together. We didn't notice anything. So Jung was very careful about keeping that private, and he could contain it. At some points, he said he didn't know if he'd be able to survive. It was very intense. He had to do deep breathing and practice yoga and stuff. But again, what the map is helpful for, which is what he elaborated after the experiences, is to place these experiences in a position in our life story, in our narrative, that gives them value and that shows us a pattern. How has your life been directed by the hidden hand, as Jung calls it, the hidden hand above my head that directs my destiny? How has your life been directed to the point where you are now? And if you could see some of the details of it, some of the markers, some of the turning points, and how that took place, you know, falling in love is another one. If a man experiences the anima, or a woman finds the animus in a man, they fall madly in love, that changes your life, even if it doesn't work out. It's an important life experience. And I've worked with people over the years who say that's the most important experience I've ever had in my life. It brought me the most feeling, the most intense awareness of the other and of myself. That's getting in contact with the unconscious as well as with the other person. You're meeting yourself when you meet the depth in others. You're also meeting yourself. And those self-meetings are very important in developing a sense of yourself, who you are, what you're like, what you are, not only who you are, not only your conscious identity, but what you are and what your life means and stands for. So that's the map of the soul.
Wow. Oh, I am. Murray, would you? I mean, you put this in your own words, but there's a sense that, well, I think about the quote that Jung has. It's I'm glad I'm Jung and not a Jungian, right? And so he's in some ways alluding, I think, to, okay, this is my experience, and I'm going to somehow give words and language, and we can take those words and language and try to fit our story into them. But would you say that it's almost our work to become map makers of our own soul? I mean, is that what we're really called into into this kind of Jungian framework?
Well, Jung thought of himself as a pioneer. I'll answer that question in just a moment. But Jung thought of himself as a pioneer. So imagine going out. My ancestors on my mother's side of the family immigrated to Canada when in the 1890s, and they came as a group of people. They were all Baptists. The whole village immigrated to Canada because they didn't want their sons to be drafted into the Prussian army. So they went to Canada, and when they got there, they were given a piece of land out in Saskatchewan. They were taken on a wagon with some supplies, and the government officials said, well, here's your piece of land. These are the markers. Have at it. And they spent their first night dug a hole, their first winter, dug a hole, put a tarpaulin over it. It was fall, and they survived the winter, all of them. And the next spring, they started clearing the land. Okay. Those were pioneers. So when you find your way, you aren't required to make your own map. The map has been made. You can use it, or you can use another map. There are other maps, but you don't have to make the map. What you have to do is have the experience. And the map helps you get deeper into the experience. No, I wouldn't say each person has to be their own map maker, but each person has to have their own experience. You aren't meant to have Jung's experiences. You aren't meant to have active imagination with Philemon. That was Jung's inner guide and teacher. You have to find your own. How do you do that? Well, you do your own inner work. You follow your dreams. They aren't anybody else's dreams. You follow your active imagination. So when I tell people how to do active imagination, I sometimes give a class to students. How do we do active imagination? First thing, clear your mind, and then wait for something to appear. And whatever appears, accept it. Don't reject it, no matter what it is. You might not like it. You might think it's, just a third rate. you want to see, an image of the Buddha or something. Instead, you get a rabbit. Follow the rabbit. Accept whatever comes to you. And if it moves, follow it. Whatever is moving in your imagination, stay with it. And go as far as you can with it. And stay with it day after day after day for a period of time. And after a period of time, you will have your own inner world to go to. That isn't anybody else's inner world. It's not Jung's. Jung had his, you will have yours, and yours will be different. So yours depends on your psyche. And each individual is unique. That is a fundamental precept or doctrine, if you will, of analytical psychology, the uniqueness of the individual. Jung focused on that, emphasized it, maybe even exaggerated. That doesn't mean that we're absolutely different from everybody else in all respects, but we are one of a kind, one-time individuals. And so you will have your own individual experience of the inner world. It might compare with others that you know. You can tell them yours and they'll tell you theirs, and you can compare and contrast, but stick with your own. The collective unconscious is what we all share. There is a level of the psyche that Jung hypothesizes. Okay, he says, this is a hypothesis. It isn't something to believe or disbelieve, but maybe you can use it. And he discovered this through researches in comparative anthropology and literary studies and religion. What he found was patterns. Looking at the experiences, let's say the numinous religious experiences of many different peoples, looking at their mythologies. Their mythologies are their account of their numinous experiences. And he found that there were many commonalities. And he said every culture that has ever existed has had a religion or a myth, because human beings are myth makers, and they have a religious instinct. What is that? That is a sense of there's something that we can't see with our senses, but that does exist out there. Something invisible. There's an invisible world that surrounds us. Okay, and so we sometimes we experience that invisible world, and then we make a record of it and we talk about it. And all the gods and goddesses of the religions were symbols and representations of this invisible world. So you can compare mythologies, and you can see every mythology seems to have a hero. Every mythology has a mother. So these are archetypal images that belong to the collective. But we all have our unique experience of them. And so if you take Christ, for example, as an archetypal figure, which Jung discusses many times, many places, because it really was a part of his experience. Also, he experienced visions of Christ several times that he writes about. And he says Christ is an archetype of the self, an archetypal image of the self. Almost, not quite complete, because he doesn't include the dark side. Okay. Where's the dark side? Well, the dark side is Satan, his brother. And they have a conversation in the desert, and Christ rejects him. He doesn't make an alliance with Satan. So in Christianity, there is a rejection of evil. Okay, Jung thinks that was necessary at the time, but it needs to be revised now after 2,000 years. But the experience of Christ is the experience of what Jung would call an archetypal image. If you were an ancient Greek and you went into the temple of Aphrodite, you might have an experience of Aphrodite, the goddess. It's not a theory, it's not an idea. She would be there. You would see her. You'd have a vision of her. People had visions of the gods and goddesses, and they spoke to them. Or you would stare at a statue of the god or goddess, and you would ask a question, and the god would nod to you, or the god would object somehow. So your psyche is, we say, projecting either a visionary image or a movement in a stable object, material object, that is then speaking to you. Your psyche is speaking to you. And then the theologically minded people would always come to Jung and say, but do these images have any ontological standing, metaphysical standing? Do they exist outside the human psyche on their own? And they just come and appear to us. Now, there are people today who claim to have communication with invisible personalities or creatures, aliens from another dimension who are visiting us regularly, and they can channel them. I listened to a podcast the other day by a channeler, and he claimed that he's channeling so-and-so, a figure from another dimension, and this figure is giving him a lot of information. Now, the Jungian would say, well, you're in contact with an archetype of the collective unconscious. You're hearing something that is valuable. It's good information. He says what this teacher is teaching about is all about love, how love is entering the human domain, and we can choose between love and not love. And so it's good teaching. Well, that was Christ's teaching. Christ also taught about love. Maybe Christ was an alien visiting us. You can think in different ways about this. And Jung keeps it to the psychological most of the time, but not all the time. He leaves open the possibility. He says, I'm talking about God images, what people experience. I'm not talking about the thing in itself, per se. So he makes a distinction between archetypal images and the archetype per se. The archetype per se is beyond our capacities to experience directly. But his theory, his hypothesis, is that this archetype per se sends us manifestations into the psyche in the form of images, ideas, intuitions, and sometimes synchronicities. And when he gets to the topic of synchronicity, these synchronicities are these meaningful coincidences in time where you have like a dream image and then you see it outside yourself the next day, or these are things that fall together. The psychic world and the material world suddenly fall together in a certain moment. That's called synchronicity. And Jung says these coincidences deliver meaning. We don't make the meaning, we read the meaning, we discover the meaning of them. Sometimes it's very hard to do. But when he talks about that, he transgresses the psychic boundary. How is it possible that something could coincide in the psyche and the material world at the same time? What's behind that? Who's behind that? So when you have meaningful experiences that change your life, like my discovering Jung's work, just a fluke, or you fall in love with a stranger on the airplane, and that changes your life. I've talked to people that happened to. What explains that? So there, Jung seems to suggest that there is something behind experience and the material world that can coordinate them. Now, this has been called in recent times dual aspect monism, and it's been written about by a man named Harold Ottmansbacher. He's a Swiss scientist and philosopher, lives in Zurich, and he's written some books. You can look him up. I think he's got some YouTube lectures. Ottmansbacher, Harold Ottmansbacher. And he's elaborated this theory that he calls dual aspect monism. So there's a monad that's outside or behind or below or above that manifests itself in two ways. One is a psychic way and one is a material way. And it can send these manifestations into time so that they form a synchronicity in time. And it's hard to know for sure what it's up to. Why is it doing that? But if you have a sense of a personal destiny, you feel that there is a hidden hand that has guided your personal destiny in a certain way. That would be the monad behind the synchronicities that have shaped your life. So the archetypes, the archetypal images, gods and goddesses and so on, could be manifestations of something that exists beyond the psyche, but we can't really get to it and know it for sure. We can experience the images and the ideas that come, but the source is beyond us. So the theologian would say, well, that's the God beyond experience that's working these codes. And the thing about Jungian psychology, it focuses so much on the individual that we get a sense that destiny is a personal thing. There's a personal interest in that monad. That's very Christian, you know. God sees every sparrow that falls. He knows every name of every person that lives, every soul, and he loves them all and is concerned about them all. He's a shepherd of the sheep, and all that is Christian teaching. In a way, what Jung did, I think, is very carefully translate religious teachings, dogmas, and so on into psychological terminology, and make use of it by uh, applying it to the experiences that we have as individuals. So it makes religion a very individual enterprise. Jung did not trust groups, and he thought that groups are very dangerous. The lowest common denominator of consciousness, he says, is what dominates groups. Power struggles. He says, where there's power, there's no love. So he was very avoidant of groups and suspicious of them. Um, uh, and that applies to religious groups as well as any political groups or any other type of groups. So
Yeah.
he was much for kind of individual religious experience and spirituality, very
I
much
love.
emphasized the individual. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that kind of brings me to what feels like a really essential question for everyone listening. I mean, it's one for me for sure, and so I like to call it the common Christian myth. I think everyone on this call, everyone listening, likely has been impacted, been touched at some level by these common images, these common beliefs and assumptions that guide life and kind of establish a sense of collective consciousness, right? Um, but I would say everyone listening has at some point had to significantly question that mythology, or their life experience, as you're talking about, has pulled them out of that myth, right? Their experiences have led them to encounter images, archetypal images that uh, the common Christian myth may even reject, right? Like Jesus and Satan saying, "Oh, I reject you. I'm not going to engage. I'm not going to deal with the shadow, deal with what is hidden, deal with evil." Um, and so, what would you say for people who are kind of either, I mean, because on this call just right now, we have priests, we have pastors, we have leaders, we have people who have left those roles. But I'd say all of us find ourselves in this kind of threshold of we have to connect with spirituality. That old paradigm simply does not meet the needs, does not give language, in fact, rejects our experience. So, what is it like? How then should we live? I mean, I think that's the big question. How then should we navigate? Is it a new mythology? Is it a personal myth that we're to engage? What's the way forward?
Well, I grew up in a very Christian family. My father was a Baptist preacher, pastor. So I grew up with a Bible. When I went to Israel the first time some years ago, it was like I discovered my neighborhood. It was so familiar, the names of the places. It was more familiar than where I had lived with my family in North Dakota and South Dakota and various places, Michigan. So I continue to read the Bible myself, but I don't go to church. I did attend church for a while in Zurich. There was a very fine old church founded by Charlemagne in the year 800, I think, and called the Grossmünster. And they have quite good pastors and preachers there, and I've heard some pretty good sermons there. But it doesn't really move me very much, and I've tended to over the years. I wouldn't say distance myself from the church, but I was ordained as a Presbyterian minister when I was young, and I served in the Presbyterian church in what they called a special ministry. They were very liberal in the 70s when I was ordained, and they allowed me to function as a Jungian analyst and teacher in a special ministry. So that's how I stayed in contact with the church. So I never left the church. I still don't feel alienated from it. Um, but it doesn't really touch my soul very much. So the music sometimes. And I also work with a number of retired pastors, and they've really left the church. I mean, they can hardly bear to step into a church. I think they're over churched. They're churched out. Like, they're just tired of it, but they need something that they originally found there. They found a map. They found the guidance in the scriptures and so on. So when I work with them, we work in a Jungian way, and we work with their dreams, and with active imagination and reflection and observing synchronicities. And gradually they form their own path. It's a kind of personal religious path, spirituality. It doesn't mean they reject the church or really have left it in a broken way, but they distance themselves from it, and they can still use some of its resources. What the church has that can be wonderful is a sense of community, support. It's like AA that way, it's a supportive community where you can have some friends and you can lean on each other and look to each other for help if you need it. This other way, this individual way, is a kind of lonely way. People today, there are many people, studies have been done about the loneliness epidemic in developed countries, especially during COVID, but continuing after that. Here in Switzerland, an unprecedented number of people are living alone. Young people, older people, living by themselves in apartments. And they often describe their experience as very lonely. When they go to see their doctors or talk to other people, maybe they can join a club or, a study group or something that helps a bit. I work with a woman who's in her late 80s. She's Jewish. And she has made a very good life with herself. She does active imagination every week with a transcendent figure who gives her all kinds of support. But she also goes to a Torah study group every week, and they read in the Bible. And she goes to some holidays. She's not a member of the synagogue, but she uses it for community and support and a sense of roots. The individual. Jung also emphasized this, the rootlessness of the modern person living in a city. And Jung discovered his roots through studying the church fathers, studying the Gnostics, studying the alchemists. And he linked, modern psychology to all these esoteric traditions and to the past. And he always carried a Bible around in his pocket, his son told me. And when he was on the train and had some time, he would open the Bible and read a passage. If you look in his index, in the index to his collected works, under Bible, you find pages and pages of references to biblical passages. So he had a kind of, and he speaks about an invisible church. So he felt communitas with the past, with believers, with the present. He had friends and acquaintances who were his father, 6 uncles who were ministers. So I think the community can offer resources if we take it in a certain way, not as, quotes, absolute authority tells you what to do, what to believe, how to believe it, and what this passage means in the Bible, what that one means. None of that. That's for children. That's Sunday school stuff. But after a certain point, reflection on various biblical passages can be very nourishing and interesting. I read the Bible regularly. I just recently read the Gospel of John again. Jesus' feet barely touch the ground in the Gospel of John. He's the Word who becomes flesh. And does all kinds of interesting miracles and so on. So you can read it. I had a professor at Yale, Hans Frey. He wrote a book. He was a Jewish convert to Christianity and a very strong believer in the Christian gospel. And he said you should read the Gospels as narrative. Don't read them as theology. Read them as a story. And read Jesus as a very interesting character in the story. Who is he? What does he do? What does he decide? What does he reject? Read him like you would read a novel by Tolstoy. And that's the way I've been reading the Gospels lately. Or you read the epistles of Paul in a good translation. And I was astonished after all these years reading the epistles again that he talks so much about love. That's almost all he talks about. And it's a wonderful translation of the meaning of Christ for human beings. What did Christ bring? Love. And that he tries to transmit that and encourage it and speak for it. And so I think the less theologically you read these texts, more as literature or meaningful descriptions of experiences, visionary experiences that ancient people had that are still speak to us in certain symbolic ways. It can be very nourishing for the soul, I find.
Hi, Michael here. Hey, seriously, thank you for listening and engaging the Inner Work Community podcast. I trust today's episode gave you something to reflect on or illuminated a new trailhead to your hidden life. If this episode resonated with you, you can subscribe, share it with your people, and leave a review. That really helps spread the word and boost our online presence in this digital world. Remember, growth is not a straight line, and we're all figuring it out as we go. I'm grateful to be in this unfolding and excavating work with you. So, until next time, be yourself. You've got a good self. And remember, it's all a gift.